On October the 25th, 1994, at 8:45 p.m., 23-year-old Susan Smith sat in the driver's seat of her burgundy Mazda Protege, tears streaming down her face, staring straight ahead at the dark, murky waters of John D. Long Lake. The only sounds she heard were those of her own muffled cries and the restful breathing of her two sons, 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex, who were both fast asleep in the back seat of her car, secured in their car seats. As Susan's silent tears streamed down her cheeks, she thought of the events in her life leading up to this point, how only 2 prior it was Michael's 3-year-old birthday party, and the boys were laughing and having so much fun, eating birthday cake and playing with their new gifts. And little Alex, who had just recently started taking his very first steps, and how Alex was still a bit wobbly on his tiny feet as he made his way into her outstretched arms as she coached him by saying, "Come on, Alex, come to Mommy." Susan sat staring out at the lake, thinking how her entire life had been one letdown after another, and no matter what had ever happened that seemed good in her life, it had always ended up being something hurtful and crushing eventually, and always, in the end, there was never a happy ending for Susan. She was tired of trying, tired of hoping and believing. Susan wanted to end her life, and this was not the first time that she had wanted to die and had even attempted to end her own life. This time, she was determined. She was completely done. The boys' dad, David Smith, had walked out on her and the boys back in August. David and Susan's marriage had been rocky since even before their wedding, and it had only escalated since the birth of their first son, Michael. They had an on-again, off-again marriage, where they both had extramarital affairs and eventually just ended up having what appeared to be an open marriage. But living together while maintaining these sorts of relationships proved to only cause chaos and turmoil in their home. So David packed his things and moved out just 2 months prior. Susan thought that if she went back home, it was just going to be more sleepless nights, early mornings, no time to even spend with her boys, as she worked every day while they were in daycare. Her one hope of giving her boys a better life had just crushed her heart and dreams. This one hope told her that he did not want kids, basically saying that she was well below him and his lifestyle of coming from a rich and powerful family and hers being poor and broken. They were from 2 different worlds, basically telling her that he was much better than her. The words that Tom Finley wrote in his Dear Jane letter to her only a week earlier stung and crushed the last bit of belief that Susan had for a better life for her and her boys. Tom basically wrote to her in the letter saying she was not good enough for him. She was poor in his eyes. She came from a broken and dysfunctional family. She did not and would never have a chance with him for anything more than an occasional no-strings-attached sex call. Pointed out also in no uncertain terms that he did not want children in his life, and she had children, so she needed to move on and find someone else that was in her own league, because it was not and would never be him. Susan loved her sons. She did not want them to have to face this cruel, cold, and unfair world alone without their mother, so she was going to take them with her. Susan had decided that the 3 of them would leave this world together. She had initially thought of stopping at the high bridge, and with Michael in one arm and Alex in the other, and one on each of her hips, she was going to jump from the bridge, all 3 of them together. But as she drove over the bridge, there was too much traffic, and she continued to drive, ending up at John D. Long Lake. Susan took the car out of park and put it into neutral. The car slowly started rolling down the boat ramp closer to the water. As the car's headlights got closer, she slammed on the brakes, pulled the emergency brake up, and tried to catch her breath. Breathing heavily, clutching the steering wheel, crying, she looked back up out at the waters, which was now very close to the car. After a couple of minutes, she took another deep breath, put the emergency brake down, put the car back in neutral, and again began to slowly roll towards the water. When the front of the car contacted the water, she again slammed on the brakes, pulled up the emergency brake, and stopped the car. But this time, she got out and stood beside the car. She reached inside the car, disengaged the emergency brake, put the car back in neutral, and as the car began to roll down into the water, she stood and watched as the water took her car and her small sons inside, still strapped in their car seats. As the car contacted the water, she stood watching as it began to flip over, upside down, and eventually disappearing as it sunk. Susan stood with her hands covering her ears. If the boys were crying or screaming for her, she did not want to hear it. After the car had fully sunk, she started running. Her mind was racing with thoughts on what she was going to say about what happened and where her children were. After she had run for what seemed like forever but was only a very short distance, she saw a house with the lights on, and she ran to the front door and began frantically knocking and screaming, "Help me, help me, he's..."
Susan Smith has been arrested and will be charged with 2 counts of murder in connection with the deaths of her children, Michael 3 and Alexander 14 months. The vehicle, a 1990 Mazda, driven by Smith, was located late Thursday afternoon in Lake John D. Long near Union. 2 bodies were found in the vehicle's back seat.
She needs a psychiatrist. She needs something worse.
Babies. Susan Lee Vaughn was born September the 26th, 1971 in Union, South Carolina, to Harry and Linda Vaughn. Susan was the youngest of the couple's 3 children, and she was the only girl, having 2 older brothers. Susan had a very unstable childhood filled with trauma after trauma, one of the worst being her father, whom she absolutely adored, committing suicide by a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the chest when she was only 6 years old. Her father was highly abusive to her mother, but for some reason he absolutely adored Susan, and she him as well. Susan kept her dad's coin collection and an audio recording of his voice, which she listened to daily. Susan's father's death affected her on extreme levels. She suffered deep depression afterwards. She attempted to take her own life on more than one occasion. Once when she was only 13, and again when she was 16. Susan was diagnosed with dependent personality disorder. Soon after Susan's father died, her mother remarried a man named Beverly Russell Jr., also known as Bev. Bev was divorced and had 3 children from his former marriage. Bev was well known in the community. He was a prominent, well-off and respected Christian man, and he was in high standing and ranks in the town's Christian coalition, as well as one of the main leaders in the city's Republican Party. Now, even though her stepfather had been a part of her life since she was 6 years old, Susan began sitting in his lap when she was 16, and she would lay her head on his chest to relax after school. Soon, Bev began putting his hands up her shirt. He would funnel her breast and eventually into her lower private area. The molestation never went as far as intercourse at that time. It stayed to fondling and heavy petting until Susan turned 18. In 1987, when Susan was 16 years old, she told her high school guidance counselor the things that her stepfather was doing to her. The guidance counselor instructed her to tell her mother, which she did. When Linda confronted her husband, Bev, about these accusations, he immediately began to cry, and he admitted that he had been fondling Susan's breast and lower private areas. He said he was ashamed and he wanted to get help, which he did go away to get that help. He left home for a short period of time and was receiving therapy, but after he returned back home, the molestation continued. Susan would attempt to take her own life again later that same year. When Susan was 17 years old, she was working at a cashier at the Winn-Dixie. She began having an affair with a co-worker. This man was older than Susan, and he was also married and had children. This affair was short-lived as the man broke it off with Susan. Distraught at being rejected by her married lover, she again attempted to take her life by swallowing a handful of Tylenol and aspirin. This attempt at self-harm resulted in her being diagnosed as having adjustment disorder, and that is brought on by stress. In 1989, and at 18 years old, while talking with her therapist, Susan told him all about her now sexual relationship with her stepfather, saying that their relationship was consensual and it was not forced at all. She admitted that she was hurt when she saw her mother receiving all of his attention. She was jealous and she felt she deserved Bev's attention as well. Later that same year, she met and started dating another co-worker at Winn-Dixie, 20-year-old David Smith. David was much closer to her age. He had never been married, and he had been raised in a very strict home that followed the religion of Jehovah's Witness. The two of them hit it on great, or it seemed. Both David and Susan came from families that seemed very stricken with tragedies one after another, but they were so in love with each other and had plans of having children and sharing a very happy and healthy life together. They were married within a year of meeting. Susan was 19 years old and 2 months pregnant with their first son, who would be named Michael, when the couple tied the knot. But within a year after they were married, tragedy hit. David lost his brother to complications of Crohn's disease, and then following David's brother's untimely death, David's father attempted suicide by taking a handful of pills. Susan was the one that found his father stretched out in the floor unconscious. Fortunately, he did survive. David and Susan had a very rocky relationship almost from the start of their marriage. They had heated arguments. They could never seem to agree on anything, and both were cheating on each other almost from the very beginning. Later, David would say during an interview with AP News, "Money became a big issue between me and Susan. They weren't on the same page regarding intimacy. Their arguments would get physical." David admitted one time when Susan said that she was leaving and was going to move back in with her mother, he said, quote, "Shamefully, I did grab Susan by her arms. I dragged her out of the bed and out to the front porch. I didn't throw her down or anything. I just let her down on the porch." End quote. He went on to say, "I've said before, and I admit I was a lousy husband, but I was always a good father to my kids." In 1993, Susan began a new job making $6 an hour as a bookkeeper at a large company called Conso Products. Susan quickly moved up the ladder at the company and was soon working as the personal secretary of the company's owner. This is when she met the owner's 27-year-old son, Tom Finlay. Tom was immediately smitten with Susan's good looks and her pleasant personality. He asked her out to dinner, to which Susan quickly smiled and accepted. Tom Finlay was known around the company by the other female employees as perfect bachelor. He was handsome and rich, and Susan felt very special that Tom would take notice of her and ask her out. The two dated for most of the year, and all while Susan was still married to David. However, David was also dating other women at this time. Susan was also carrying on her secret affair with her stepfather, Bev, during this time. The longer she dated Tom, the more attached she became to him. She started believing that he may even ask her to marry him. She even fantasized about giving her boys the life that she never had and living without worries of financial struggles. Susan eventually fell in love with Tom. Once, when her and Tom were out on a date, David saw them together. He lost control and he assaulted Tom, screaming, "That's my wife. What are you doing with my wife?" But the thing is, David also was seeing someone else at this time. Nevertheless, this put Tom in a different mindset of dating Susan. Even though she had never lied to Tom about being married to David, Susan and Dave did file for divorce in September of 1994. In October of 1994, Tom wrote Susan a letter breaking things off between them. On October the 25th, 1994, Susan went into Tom's office at Conso, crying and telling him he could not just leave her like that. She was in a very bad place in her life and was going through the divorce with David, and that David was threatening that he was going to make some very personal information about her public. And this information that David threatened to make public would absolutely destroy Susan's family. She never told Tom what that information was, but it did later come out that the information she claimed that David was going to bring out was that she was still having sexual relations with her stepfather, Bev Russell. When Susan saw that her tears and pleas were not affecting Tom's decision whatsoever about breaking up with her, she then told him out of revenge that she had also been sleeping with his father. Tom told her to leave his office, and she needed to get help. Susan walked out, only to turn around and tell Tom that it wasn't true about her sleeping with his father. She had just told him that to see how he would react, and again Tom told her to leave. Susan left Conso, picked her boys up from daycare, went to Pizza Hut, and had dinner with Michael and Alex. She then started driving and crying and thinking about how she could not take life anymore. Nothing ever worked out for her. She decided that she was going to end her life and take her boys with her. After contemplating jumping off the high bridge and then deciding against that, she drove straight to John D. Long Lake, driving the car onto the boat ramp. She stopped twice as the car's headlights illuminated the dark waters coming closer and closer to the car. She pulled on the emergency brake, got out of the car, reached back in, put the emergency brake down, put the car in neutral, and watched as the car with her boys strapped in their car seats slowly drifted out into the murky waters. The car seemed to just sit still for several minutes until it finally started tilting and flipping upside down and slowly sinking into the water. When the car had totally disappeared under the dark water, she started screaming, "Oh my God, what have I done? Oh my God, my babies." She turned and began to run. She spotted a light on at a nearby home and went straight to the door, beating on the door, screaming, "Help me." Susan reported to the police that she had been hijacked by a black man and her car stolen with her son still inside in the back seat in their car seat. For 9 days she carried on with this story and made several television interview appearances with David, pleading with the abductor to please bring the boys back, always claiming that the black man seized control of her car as she waited at a stoplight and then forced her out of her car at gunpoint and drove off with her sons. Both David and Susan were giving a few polygraph tests each. David passed each test with no deception indicated. However, his tests were each inconclusive. Several clues early into the investigation indicated that she was not telling the truth. The first being when detectives interviewed a city maintenance worker who said that the traffic light where Susan claimed to have stopped didn't turn red unless there were other cars present, and that contradicted her story. When Susan was confronted with this inconsistency of her story and the information they learned from the city maintenance worker, she changed her story and said that the carjacking took place on a different road 10 miles away. But surveillance video contradicted this story too. Susan was then brought in for questioning on November the 3rd, 1994. The agent questioning her was a family friend, Pete Logan. She had known him and he had known her for many years and was also friends with her mom and stepfather, Linda and Bev. When Susan was again confronted about her latest story not being true, she finally broke down crying, putting her head in her hands. She asked the officer to hold her hands and pray with her, and then she admitted that her children were dead. She told him exactly what she had done. Susan was then arrested, and a press conference that shocked the public was given, stating that Susan had been arrested for the murders of Michael and Alex. David Smith learned of Susan's confession on television. Susan was arrested and was banned from attending Michael and Alex's funeral in person, but she was allowed to watch the service on television as it was being aired live nationwide. There were over 5,000 people at Union and at the cemetery at Bogansville United Methodist Church. This is where the boys were buried together, holding hands in a single casket. Nearly 800 sprays of funeral flowers, including one from then President Bill Clinton, were sent in condolence. During the trial, Susan's defense team argued that Susan was plagued by mental illness that came from her father's suicide when she was only 6 years old, and because she was being sexually abused as a child and the many emotional rejects that she had faced her entire life. However, the prosecution painted a very different picture of Susan, arguing that she was a cold-blooded manipulator and murdered her children, believing that if she did not have children, that Tom Finlay would then come back to her and she could still have that rich lifestyle that she had always longed for. During the trial, Susan's stepfather, Bev Russell, took the stand, admitting that he and Susan did indeed have a consensual sexual relationship. When asked when the last time they had slept together was, Bev said it was about 6 weeks before she murdered Michael and Alex. He also admitted to sexually assaulting Susan when she was a young teen, and Susan's mother had been made aware of this. Adding to that, Susan's mother, his wife Linda, that neither Susan nor Linda ever pressed charges against him. He went on to ask the court to please spare Susan's life because he bore some of the responsibilities for the crimes due to the SA that he'd done to her when she was 16 years old. Also testifying for the defense was Seymour Halleck, a psychiatrist and law professor. Halleck testified that Susan was suffering from severe depression and suicidal tendencies. On July the 22nd, 1995, the jury returned with their verdict after only 2.5 hours of deliberation, found Susan guilty of 2 accounts of first-degree murder. Susan was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 30 years. First, eligibility being on November the 4th, 2024. Susan was spared the death penalty due to her mental illness diagnoses, as well as her past mental issues. After the trial was over, David Smith stood on the courthouse steps and spoke, saying, quote, "I will never forget what Susan has done. I will never forget Michael and Alex. Me and my family, of course, are disappointed that the death penalty was not the verdict," end quote. Though initially held in the Women's Correctional Center in Columbia, South Carolina, Susan was transferred to and incarcerated at the Leith Correctional Institution in Greenwood, South Carolina, due to committing several infractions ranging from drug use issues to self-harm. She lost a variety of privileges for these infractions, such as loss of phone, canteen, and visitation privileges for up to a year at a time. She was also caught in various sex scandals with prison workers, one being in the year of 2000, when then 28-year-old Susan was disciplined for having sexual relations with a 50-year-old Houston Cagle prison guard. This was 4 different times. The relationship was discovered when Susan tested positive for having an STD. Susan admitted to having sexual relations with Cagle 4 times. Cagle was fired from his job and served 3 months in jail for pleading guilty to an illicit sexual relationship. The next year, in 2001, it was learned that she was having sexual relations with prison captain Alfred Rowe. Rowe pleaded guilty to having a illegal sexual relationship with Susan, and he too was fired and sentenced to 5 years probation. Today, Susan remains incarcerated at Leith Correctional Institute. A prison source told People magazine that no one trusts her to be alone with the guard, adding that she spends most of her time in her cell or working, but when she's being transported, there is always a male and a female guard with her. They went on to say that she doesn't talk about her boys very much, but when she does, it's always with a lot of sadness. She doesn't expect anyone to forgive her, and she doesn't look for pity. She's still in mourning, and she'll never stop mourning for the rest of her life. In 2015, Susan finally reached out and broke her decades-long silence about that night, writing a letter to South Carolina's newspaper, The State. And she wrote, "It has been hard to listen to lie after lie and not be able to defend myself. It's frustrating, to say the least. The thing that hurts me the most is that people think that I hurt my children in order to be with a man, and that is so far from the truth. There was no motive, as it was not even a planned event. I was not in my right mind." She went on to say that she had made up the false story about the kids' abduction because she didn't know how to tell the people who loved Michael and Alex they was never going to see them again. Melissa Moore, a crime correspondent with the Dr. Oz show, said that while communicating with Susan in prison, she realized that Susan was a joy to talk to, and she said if she did not commit those crimes, she could be your best friend. However, John Osment, a former director of the South Carolina Department of Corrections, told the New York Post that Susan will always be a manipulative person. It's just who she is, adding that it is highly unlikely that Susan will make parole, at least not the first time around. Still today, Susan continues to say that what happened that night was an absolute mental break from reality. She says she absolutely lost all thoughts of reality and acted in the absolute worst way imaginable. She was not herself that night, she says. She often talks to Michael and Alex while looking at photos of them that she keeps in an album in her cell. Today, 51-year-old Susan Smith is on a better path in prison and awaiting her parole hearing set for November the 4th, 2024. It is unknown at this time whether Susan will be able to convince a parole board to release her, given the severity of her crimes and her prior record of infractions in prison, as well as the Smith family will appear to give testimony against her release. She's behaving herself these days, a source from the prison said. She knows that her parole date is coming up very soon, and she can't get parole if she's not being good. Earlier this year, Susan worked as a senior teaching assistant, tutoring other inmates seeking their GED. She also watches visitors' children while they are visiting with their loved ones at the prison. Sources have also revealed that Susan has vowed to a fresh start with a long-distance boyfriend if she receives parole, adding that they write letters to each other all the time. They share handwritten letters about what their future is going to be like. She's very romantic like that, always wanting to find her happily ever after. And this is coming from one of Susan's family. While Susan will attend her hearing via video conferencing, relatives of Michael and Alex will speak to the parole board in person. They may also file a victim's impact affidavit to voice their opinions about her request for parole. David's family members have previously expressed concern that she would be paroled, saying, "I don't think she's got a snowball's chance in hell of getting paroled in 2024. And I think her husband David realized that too. She's exactly where she needs to be. Everyone is against her getting out, and we will do what it takes to keep her in there." They went on to say, "So she's got a job and she's behaving herself. Big deal. That's literally the least you can do after you kill your 2 little boys. She's not going to get out of jail without a fight." Since the death of Michael and Alex, David Smith has lost his older brother, who he was very close to, Danny. And then almost 2 years after the deaths of Michael and Alex, David's stepmother, also named Susan Smith, committed suicide. David remarried in April of 2003 to a lady named Tiffany Moss. He and Tiffany have a daughter together named Savannah. David also has a son named Nicholas. Nicholas was born after Savannah from a separate relationship. Nicholas lives with his mother. In interviews, David has said that he is forever haunted by what happened to his sons. In 2010, he said that there is always this nagging and gnawing heartache. It's there every day, even if I'm not always conscious of it. David has also vowed to fight to keep Susan behind bars as the date draws nearer and nearer for her to become eligible for parole. The lake where Susan drowned Michael and Alex went on to become a memorial for them. It drew countless visitors who wanted to take pictures or leave flowers for the boys. And in 1996, its grim reputation darkened even more when 7 people, including 4 kids, drowned there after stopping to look at the memorials and pay respects to Michael and Alex. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to follow this video into the Skankersball Live, where we will discuss this case and learn even more about it.